Okay, good morning, students. It's Thursday, April 1st. Happy Fool's Day. Any tricks you're gonna play? I'm coming to you from my very comfortable sit spot. It's actually one of my van chairs set out in my yard, so I can hear the birds in the morning. I notice that they're chirping a lot. Coyote is definitely interested in everything going on right now. She's very fascinated with all of the happenings around our yard. And I don't know if you can hear, but if I tune in and close my eyes and just listen, I hear birds. Maybe I can sort of try to estimate how many birds and what direction they're in. What type of bird? Are there more than one? And I can also start to hear, or I could hear before, there's a motor running. There's some industrial site behind my house. So this sort of brings up this intersection between human nature and society and nature, or in the environment. And I had a lot of really great discussions yesterday in the DBAs, the discussion-based assessments. And from one student in particular who was asking this question, what does a sit spot have to do with a chemical? Because I had related it in our other video to DDT, which is a pesticide, an insecticide. So it means it kills insects. And it's very true. What does it have to do with a chemical? Sit spot, chemical, what? And the connection here is this very influential book called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And Rachel Carson is known as the, here the book says, the classic that launched the environmental movement. And she's sometimes known as like the godmother or the grandmother of the environmental movement. And I do want to take a minute here and read a little bit from this book so you get a better understanding here. I'm going to read this and then I'm going to play a little video. And this, before we get too far into sort of this little mini lesson, I'm going to use this video and seed a path. So this is going to be a path here. And you can comment below. And the question is, what is the intersection between humans paying attention to their environment and environmental movements? And how do we get up and take action once we notice something? So the gist of this is Rachel Carson sat in her backyard listening for the frogs, listening basically for anything, but she normally heard frogs. And then as this chemical started to be used, it killed the insects, and what eats insects? Frogs. So she was able to detect that there were no sound from frogs anymore, and that's where the silent spring comes in. It'd be like, imagine I'm sitting here and I don't hear birds anymore. I would know maybe something's up. And she is a researcher, so she went and she started to investigate that. And what she found out was that this chemical, DDT, was being used. And so, yeah, to give you a little bit more context, I guess I'm going to play this PBS. Okay, so I'm going to play this documentary from PBS, Malaria and the Silent Spring. And I think this does a great job of showing some real live clips of what it was like in 1963 to get a felt sense of this problem and how big of a movement and how big of a controversy this started. Oops. Oh. Oh, damn. Wait. You even got her name wrong. Yikes. Okay. Okay, so I'm curious what your reaction is after this film. What stood out to you? Couple things to touch on from that video. We'll take a look here. So they mentioned that DDT moves through the environment. And so here is a look at what's called biomagnification. And I magnify something, I zoom in on it. Bio meaning life. So here is magnification, you can zoom in on something, making it larger. You're increasing the scope at which you're looking at it. So here, to magnify something, what do you notice as the trend going from DDT in water, 0.0000003 parts per million, all the way up to 25 parts per million in fish-eating birds. So you notice that the DDT concentration increases 10 million times as we go up the food chain from water, zooplankton, small fish, large fish, into birds like the osprey, which is an incredible bird. that has adaptations like increased claw surface area so it can catch fish. It can also dive underwater, and it doesn't need to close its eyes, so its eyes don't need to be closed. They instead have a membrane on the top which allows them to move from air into water, which I think is really neat. So as the DDT gets accumulated in the biomass of each of these organisms, it goes up, and then it eventually can have a big effect in toxicity in these higher organisms. And we've talked a lot about parts per million, so I do want to take a minute here, and this is a cool video on how to visualize 1 part per million. So here we go, we'll watch this too. Because you've noticed these are just little dots. So I think that is a good representation then of how to visualize these tiny little chemical molecules and how they accumulate up. So 25 parts per million. Can you relate that back to the video? How many pieces within how many sugar cubes is that? I think that's a great way to think about it. Okay, so then to just dissect a little bit further what happened here. So when DDT was stopped here in 1963, right, that's the same that correlates with, and maybe is, like we just watched, has been caused by Rachel Carson's outcry about the use of DDT. What happened to the cases of malaria? And they increased. So that sparked this controversy. If we have a chemical that stops cases of malaria, shouldn't we be using it? You can think about, what's your opinion on that? What is our responsibility when we develop these synthetic chemicals, and what is our responsibility to understanding all of the consequences in nature? And here I just wanted to bring up a couple different angles. We can see this side, obviously, from a bunch of different angles, and you saw that through the video too. But the WHO, which is the World Health Organization, now currently, and this you can look back at the date, 2006, this is in the more recent century, it says DDT was extremely successful in controlling malaria in the middle of the 20th century, and the WHO actively promoted its use for this until the early 1980s. But increased health and environmental concerns surrounding DDT caused the WHO to stop promoting it and to focus instead on the two main interventions to fight malaria: drug treatment and insecticide-treated beds. Deaths from malaria have continued to rise since the 1970s. However, in countries affected by this disease and members of the scientific community have demanded that DDT should be used again for the inside residual spraying. Additionally, extensive research and testing published in the latest report of the UN Joint Meeting on Pesticide Residue in 2000 have shown that well-managed programs of spraying DDT indoors pose no harm to humans or to wildlife. So this is a different angle from the WHO, who's saying, okay, let's use it because it's actually helping the cases of malaria. But notice also here that there's other interventions: drug treatment and insecticide-treated bed nets. So it's cool to see that in the end of that video, they talked about some innovative solutions that maybe don't have to use DDT because we don't have to necessarily suffer these consequences of using this one particular drug or chemical. So here's from the other angle, the Environmental Protection Agency, which they had said that in the video, they said something like ignoring Rachel Carson's influence in creating the EPA would not be justified. And that's because her outcry here, actually in the way that she wrote and appealed to large amounts of people, spurred this public outcry that then caused the political scene to change, and they actually created the Environmental Protection Agency along this time. So the U.S., I'm going to read this here. This is from the EPA's site about DDT. And it says, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the federal agency with responsibility for regulating pesticides before the formation of the EPA in 1970, began regulatory actions in the late 1950s and 1960s to prohibit many of DDT's uses because of mounting evidence of the pesticide's declining benefits of environmental and toxicological effects. The publication in 1962 of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring stimulated widespread public concern over the dangers of improper pesticide use and the need for better pesticide controls. In 1970, EPA issued a cancellation order for DDT based on its adverse environmental effects, such as those to wildlife, as well as its potential human health risks. Since then, studies have continued, and a relationship between DDT exposure and reproductive effects in humans is suspected, based on animal studies. In addition, some animals exposed to DDT in studies developed liver tumors. As a result, today, DDT is classified as a probable human carcinogen, or something that causes cancer, by U.S. and international authorities. DDT is known to be very persistent in the environment, will accumulate in fatty tissues, and can travel long distances in the upper atmosphere. So given and considering these two different sides, we then need to make or draw a conclusion as to whether or not we would use DDT. And what do you think? What are your thoughts on this issue? That's what I want you to comment for this path. That was a lot of background information from this question that came up from Maya. What does a sit spot have to do with the chemical? And from there, you can make another connection here. And I think it's interesting to note, what does being a woman have to do with the impact that you have in the environment? Or in your environment being like the people or your audience that someone is talking to. So Rachel Carson received a lot of backlash because she was a woman. So they talked about that a little bit in the video. And I want to read just one part of Silent Spring. Here, couple of different things here. It says, hers was a trusted voice in a world riddled by uncertainty. Whenever she spoke in public, however, she took notice of ominous new trends. Intoxicated with a sense of his own power, she wrote, mankind seems to be going further and further into more experiments for the destruction of himself and his world. Technology, she feared, was moving on a faster trajectory than mankind's sense of moral responsibility. And she said later here, there would be no peace for me, she wrote to a friend, if I kept silent. Which brings me to one of my favorite quotes from actually another influential science writer or nature writer, Edward Abbey, who said, sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul. And so a lot of this brings up some sentiments like, oh my gosh, like to kill all these frogs. Or if you start developing a relationship in your backyard with the birds, and then you realize they're gone all of a sudden, what is that going to make you want to do? What kind of action do you want to take? So that's the ask. The challenge below is to comment. If you sit in your sit spot and realize a trend, what does that make you want to do? And do you have a voice as a teenager? Do you think you actually have a voice? And how can you amplify your impact? That can be as easy as talking about it. That creates ripples of change. That can be as complex as getting involved in your local government. Last night I went to a town hall meeting, and a friend brought up, "Hey, we're in the desert. Where's all the solar panels? Why can't we build infrastructure to capture the sunlight's energy and use that for energy instead of mining for fossil fuels?" And that connects to this question of mining uranium, which is used for nuclear power, which can oftentimes be thought of as a more clean version because we're not necessarily producing carbon dioxide, but instead we're relying on the impact of these molecules next to each other, these radioactive molecules. But that still has to be mined from the earth, and the tailings or the uranium waste has to go somewhere. And so if you watch here next, you can see I'll post this tailing site or cleanup site, which is outside of Moab, which is really interesting to see, right on the banks of the beautiful Colorado. So all these things, all these consequences, all these impacts that humans have on the environment are something to pay attention to. Challenge for you is to sit in your sit spot, start honing your skills of paying attention and noticing and observing. And you may as well have an effect as big as Rachel Carson. And I know there's so many kids in our class that have this potential. And I talked to a lot of you yesterday. From Cambrielle as a lawyer, someone who can sense the balance between economics and conservation as a lawyer and come to making laws that basically have an effect on this. Natalie, who's all about direct democracy, voting for actual policies. To Maya, who's really sitting down and asking these questions. To Abigail, who's going to come out with another path that you could follow, which is a challenge to stop eating meat. How would that have a positive effect on our environment? Tune in tomorrow for our live lesson to figure that out. Otherwise, engage in this discussion below. Comment on one of your classmates' posts for points for our discussion for Unit 7. Okay, awesome. It's been great chatting with you guys this morning, and I'll post this for Path. I can't wait to see what you have to say about this topic. And then also share your sit spot with us. I keep wanting to say spit spot. That's your April Fools. You can spit in your spit spot if you're sitting in your sit spot. That's up to you. But then you're sitting in your own spit. I don't know if you want to do that. All right. Hasta luego, mis estudiantes.